My aunt cut my wedding dress apart before the wedding to set her daughter up with my fiancé. Hi everyone, I'm 27 female and my husband, 33 male, have been happily married for nearly 2 years now. But every time the topic of our wedding comes up, we can't help but burst out laughing. Mostly because my aunt, whom I'll call Aunt Lydia, did everything in her power to turn it into a disaster. Honestly, it felt like a soap opera. Except her antics weren't funny. They were deliberate, manipulative, and utterly ridiculous. Let me give you some background. My husband and I met through mutual acquaintances, and we instantly hit it off. He's thoughtful, intelligent, and comes from a wonderful family. But what truly won me over was how he connected with my mom. I come from a culture where traditional values still hold sway, and it's common for parents to have the final say in choosing a child's spouse. Initially, my mom wasn't exactly thrilled about me choosing my own partner, but my husband's sincerity and respect eventually won her over. My dad, on the other hand, had always been wary of Aunt Lydia. Aunt Lydia is my dad's older sister, and she thrives on conflict and control. Knowing this, my dad decided to keep our engagement under wraps until everything was set in stone. However, once Aunt Lydia found out, all hell broke loose. Aunt Lydia was furious that I had dared to choose my own husband. She marched into our home yelling at my parents and accusing them of betraying family values. She declared it was my dad's responsibility to put a stop to the wedding. But my dad, who had grown to admire my husband, refused to budge. That's when Aunt Lydia shifted gears. She tried targeting my cousins instead. During family gatherings, she pulled them aside and whispered that my husband wasn't good enough for me. "Guys like him always have something to hide," she said. "He's probably not as nice as he pretends to be." Thankfully, my cousins weren't convinced. They had met him and genuinely liked him. A week later, we hosted a dinner for both families to officially meet. Aunt Lydia showed up and, for the first time, met my husband's parents. The second she learned he came from a successful family and was set to inherit a thriving business empire, her demeanor shifted. Suddenly, she was overly friendly, piling on compliments left and right. That same evening, she called her daughter, Emily, and invited her over. Emily, who was widely disliked by the rest of us for being unbearably self-centered, arrived and immediately dominated the conversation. Aunt Lydia then spent the evening boasting about Emily's supposed accomplishments, her imaginary career, her amazing talents, and how she would make the perfect daughter-in-law for any family. It was surreal and deeply uncomfortable. I could tell Aunt Lydia was scheming, but I decided to bide my time and let her true motives reveal themselves. That dinner turned out to be the opening act of Aunt Lydia's campaign of sabotage. As the evening drew to a close, she seemed determined to win over my fiancé's parents. She laid on the charm thick, endlessly complimenting their home, praising their son to the skies, and then casually introducing her daughter, Emily, who had made her grand entrance earlier. Emily walked in, radiating arrogance, her self-importance filling the room like an unwelcome guest. Aunt Lydia immediately began singing her daughter's praises, launching into an elaborate speech. "Emily is such an accomplished entrepreneur," she said, gesturing theatrically. "She runs everything so effortlessly, and she's just as talented at home. She truly has it all, brains, beauty, and grace." My fiancé's parents exchanged polite but strained smiles, clearly trying to mask their discomfort. Initially, I chalked Aunt Lydia's behavior up to her usual over-the-top antics, but the next evening my future mother-in-law called me, her voice uneasy. "Could we meet tomorrow?" she asked. "There's something I need to discuss with you in person." When we met, the look on her face said it all. She was worried. What she told me next made my stomach churn. Aunt Lydia had shown up at their house earlier that day, bringing Emily along for the ride. She had taken it upon herself to air old family secrets, stir up ancient drama, and even fabricate scandalous lies about me. "She told us you had past relationships," my future mother-in-law said hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable, "and that you might be interested in our money." I felt a wave of nausea. Aunt Lydia hadn't just attacked my character, she had invented outright lies to paint me as a gold digger. I rushed home and told my parents everything. My mom was livid, and even though my dad typically avoided conflict with his sister, he agreed that enough was enough. Later that evening, when Aunt Lydia arrived at our house, we confronted her. She flatly denied everything, putting on her best performance as the wounded party. "You're just making things up to ruin my name," she said, her voice dripping with mock indignation. "You've always resented me, and now you're acting like a spoiled child because you want me out of the picture." The argument quickly escalated, with shouting and accusations flying back and forth, but no resolution came of it. Aunt Lydia stormed out, leaving the rest of us emotionally drained and shaken. I was devastated, angry, hurt, and uncertain about how to move forward. My fiancé, however, remained steadfast. He reassured me over and over that none of this would ever change how he felt about me. Still, the damage Aunt Lydia had done couldn't be undone with just words. Unfortunately, her efforts to wreak havoc didn't stop there. In fact, that was only the beginning. The accusations didn't stop there, and soon Aunt Lydia concocted another plan to derail my wedding. Just a few days later, my fiancé called me, his voice tense. "You won't believe this," he said. "Emma showed up outside my office today." I froze. What was she doing there? "She said she happened to be in the area visiting a friend," he continued. But her friend wasn't answering, so she asked if I'd have lunch with her while she waited. Hearing this made my stomach twist. I knew Emma wasn't just in the area. This was calculated, just like every other one of Aunt Lydia's schemes. Thankfully, my fiancé handled the situation perfectly. He politely declined, citing work, and left. But it was clear the encounter had left him unsettled. Over the next few days, Emma found small, seemingly coincidental ways to run into him, at the gym, at coffee shops, and even near his office. Each time she was overly friendly, her intentions painfully obvious. She was trying to get closer to him. My fiancé told me about every interaction, and while I trusted him completely, I couldn't ignore how unsettling it was. The breaking point came just a week before the wedding. With all the pre-wedding festivities about to begin, Aunt Lydia pulled her boldest stunt yet. She showed up at our house uninvited, demanding to speak with my dad. "Emma has developed feelings for your future son-in-law," she declared with all the arrogance in the world. "It would be disrespectful to go through with this wedding. You need to cancel it." I couldn't believe her audacity. "My daughter is the perfect match for him," she added, her tone dripping with entitlement. "As the younger brother, it's your responsibility to honor my wishes." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all, but my dad didn't find it funny. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice firm. "This is my daughter's wedding, and it's going to happen whether you like it or not." The tension in the house was thick. My brothers, who had been biting their tongues until this point, had finally had enough of Aunt Lydia's antics. They made it clear that if she didn't drop her behavior, she wouldn't be welcome at any of the wedding events. Furious at being confronted, Aunt Lydia stormed out of the house, but we all knew this wasn't the end of her schemes. As the wedding day drew closer, her attempts to sabotage everything became even more desperate. She seemed determined to create chaos, regardless of the consequences. A few days before the pre-wedding functions began, I was busy finalizing last-minute details with my mom and cousins. Everything was finally falling into place, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the excitement building. That afternoon, one of my cousins pulled me aside, her face pale with concern. "You won't believe what I just saw," she whispered urgently. "Aunt Lydia was in your room, cutting up your wedding blouse." I froze. "What?" "She slashed it," my cousin said, anger flickering in her eyes. "Huge cuts, it's ruined." I rushed to my room, my heart pounding, and there it was, my wedding blouse, the one I had spent months designing, completely destroyed. My stomach dropped, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. My mom rushed in, assessed the damage, and without missing a beat, grabbed an older blouse from another outfit. With the help of our tailor, she managed to salvage the situation and make it work. But the incident left me shaken to my core. When confronted, Aunt Lydia flatly denied everything. "Why would I do something like that?" she said, feigning outrage. "You're just making excuses to blame me for your own mistakes." But the drama didn't end there. On the day of the wedding, Aunt Lydia made one final attempt to sabotage everything. She cornered my fiancé at the venue just before the ceremony, trying to manipulate him with more lies. "She's not who you think she is," she told him. "You can't trust her. It's not too late to reconsider." Thankfully, my fiancé wasn't swayed in the slightest. He politely but firmly told her to leave him alone. At this point, even her husband, who had mostly stayed silent through all her antics, was visibly mortified. My brothers had also reached their breaking point. Together, they confronted Aunt Lydia and demanded she leave the venue immediately. Her husband finally stepped in, embarrassed beyond belief, and dragged her out of the hall despite her protests. But Aunt Lydia didn't make it easy. She darted around the venue, trying to avoid him while my cousins and uncles looked on, laughing hysterically. She didn't seem to feel an ounce of embarrassment as her husband finally caught up to her and physically dragged her out. But Aunt Lydia wasn't done. That evening, while the wedding festivities were in full swing, she attempted to sneak out of her house and return to the venue. And she wasn't coming empty-handed. She had a bottle of kerosene with her. It was clear she had something drastic in mind. My wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love and joy. But here she was, plotting something so extreme it felt like a bad scene from a soap opera. Thankfully, karma intervened before she could act. On her way to the venue, Aunt Lydia was involved in a car accident. She fractured her leg badly and had to be rushed to the hospital. The news of her accident brought an unexpected wave of relief. It felt like the universe itself had stepped in to protect us from her madness. And despite all the chaos leading up to it, the wedding day was magical. The ceremony went off beautifully without further interruptions. My fiancé and I exchanged vows surrounded by our loved ones. The venue was stunning, the food was delicious, and the joy on my parents' faces made every challenge worth it. In the end, the day was everything I had hoped for and more. And as for Aunt Lydia, her absence turned out to be the best wedding gift of all. For the first time in several weeks, I finally felt a sense of peace. That night, during the reception, I couldn't help but reflect on everything Aunt Clara had done to try and sabotage the wedding. From pushing her daughter onto my in-laws as the perfect match, to spreading malicious rumors about me, and even ruining my wedding outfit. She had truly done everything in her power to make my day a nightmare. And yet, despite her relentless efforts, I had prevailed. After the wedding, word quickly spread about her accident and her outrageous antics. The story of Aunt Clara's grand schemes and her dramatic downfall became a running joke within the family. Even my husband couldn't help but laugh whenever we discussed it. "She really thought she could literally set the wedding on fire," he'd say, shaking his head in disbelief. "Talk about taking things way too far." While we managed to find humor in her failed attempts, I couldn't completely shake off the lingering bitterness. Aunt Clara had tried to destroy one of the most important days of my life. But why? Was it jealousy? Pride? A desperate need for control? Whatever her motivations, her actions left a scar. In the several weeks following the wedding, my family finally decided to draw a line. Aunt Clara had gone too far, and enough was enough. My two brothers, fed up with her behavior, declared she was no longer welcome at any future family events. Her husband, clearly embarrassed by her antics, didn't argue and even supported the decision. As for her daughter, Lisa, she quietly faded into the background. She stopped attending gatherings and avoided all contact with my husband's family. It was clear that Aunt Clara's schemes had backfired spectacularly, leaving both her and her daughter humiliated. With the chaos finally behind us, my husband and I moved into our new home. For the first time in what felt like several years, we could focus on building our life together without Aunt Clara's interference hanging over us. Still, the aftermath of her actions wasn't easily forgotten. My mom, still fuming over the blouse and the bottle of kerosene, outright refused to speak to her sister. "She's burned her bridges," Mum said, her voice firm. "I don't care if she's family. What she did is unforgivable." Even my dad, who typically avoided family drama, wasn't willing to let it slide. "She jeopardized my daughter's happiness," he declared. "That's not something I can ever overlook." Meanwhile, Aunt Clara's fractured leg left her bedridden for several months, effectively sidelining her from all family events. Her absence brought a strange sense of peace. No whispered insults, no passive-aggressive remarks, no plotting or scheming. It was as if a heavy shadow had lifted from our family. Lisa, on the other hand, completely disappeared from the picture. She unfollowed everyone on social media, including me and my husband, and stopped attending any family events. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that she had tried to move on by dating someone new, but her arrogance and attitude made it difficult for her to maintain relationships. Through it all, my in-laws, especially my mother-in-law, remained incredibly supportive. She even joked about Aunt Clara's antics, saying with a smirk, "At least now we know your family is never boring." But beneath her humor, I could sense a change. The whole ordeal had left her more guarded about whom she trusted, a sad but understandable outcome. As for my husband, he handled the chaos with remarkable grace. Despite being the target of Aunt Clara's schemes, he never let it shake his love or respect for me. "You're the only person I have ever wanted," he reassured me one evening as we reflected on everything that had happened. No amount of manipulation could ever change. Looking back, I realized something unexpected. Aunt Clara's actions, as painful as they had been, ultimately strengthened the bond between my husband and me. They reminded us of the people and values that truly mattered: love, trust, and the unwavering support of those who genuinely cared about us. But just when I thought the drama was finally behind us, Aunt Clara made one last attempt to claw her way back into our lives. What she did next left us shaking our heads in utter disbelief. Just as things were starting to feel normal again, Aunt Clara decided it was time for a new approach. I should have known she wouldn't stay quiet for long, but this time her tactics were so baffling they bordered on absurd. One afternoon, my mom received an unusually long message from her sister. It was dripping with sentimentality. "Family is everything," Aunt Clara wrote. "I hate seeing us so divided. Let's bury the hatchet and put the past behind us." My mom, visibly conflicted, showed me the message. Her face was unreadable. "What do you think?" she asked. I hesitated, torn between skepticism and hope. A small part of me wanted to believe Aunt Clara was being sincere, but after everything she had done, forgiveness didn't come easily. "Maybe she's finally realized the damage she's caused," I said cautiously, though doubt lingered in my mind. Several days later, Aunt Clara invited the entire family to lunch at her house. My husband and I were hesitant, but my mom, ever the optimist, urged us to go. This might be the chance for her to apologize in person, she reasoned. Reluctantly, we agreed. When we arrived, Aunt Clara greeted us with a wide, exaggerated smile that felt far from genuine. She was overly sweet, gushing about how happy she was to see us, as though nothing had ever happened. At first, everything seemed fine. But as the afternoon wore on, the cracks in her facade began to show. At one point, Aunt Clara pulled my husband aside for a private conversation. I didn't think much of it until he returned to the table, his face noticeably tense. "What happened?" I asked him quietly. He hesitated, glancing at the room to ensure no one was listening. She said she still thinks I would have been better off with Lisa," he admitted, clearly uncomfortable. "And then she tried to guilt-trip me about how much her family has been hurt through all of this." I felt a familiar wave of anger rising. Even after everything, Aunt Clara hadn't learned her lesson. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to rewrite history in her favor. By the end of the lunch, it was clear to everyone that Aunt Clara's attempt at reconciliation was little more than another performance. My mom, seeing through her sister's act, left quietly with an expression of quiet disappointment. That was the last time I saw Aunt Clara. My husband and I decided we no longer wanted her toxic presence in our lives. From that day on, we focused on surrounding ourselves with people who truly cared about us. And while Aunt Clara's antics may have left a trail of chaos, they also served as a valuable lesson. Sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the best way to protect your happiness. For the first time in several weeks, life seemed to settle down, but Aunt Clara was far from finished. During a family lunch she organized, supposedly to mend fences, her true motives became painfully clear. At one point, she cornered my husband for a private conversation. When he returned, he looked visibly uneasy. "What happened?" I asked him. "She proposed a business partnership," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She suggested I work with Kay, claiming it'd be a great way to bring the family closer." I was furious. After everything she had done, Aunt B still had the audacity to push her daughter into our lives under the guise of reconciliation. It was obvious that her so-called apology was nothing more than a calculated move. My husband and I decided we had enough and left the lunch early. That evening, we made a firm decision. We would distance ourselves from Aunt B and Kay completely. But just when we thought we were done with her, Aunt B launched one final, outrageous attack. The very next morning, we woke up to a flurry of calls from relatives. Aunt B had spread an elaborate web of lies, accusing us of rejecting her peace offering and humiliating the family. She went as far as claiming that my husband had been flirting with Kay during the lunch and that I had stormed out in a fit of jealousy. Her accusations were so absurd they were almost laughable, but they still managed to stir drama within the family. My mother-in-law was the first to call, her voice calm but tinged with concern. "Is any of this true?" she asked. I quickly explained what had actually transpired, and thankfully she believed me. Still, the damage was done. Relatives began questioning our integrity, and Aunt B was basking in the chaos she had orchestrated. That was the final straw. My husband and I decided to cut all ties with Aunt B and Kay permanently. My parents supported the decision, and even my dad, who had always been the family peacemaker, admitted that Aunt B had gone too far. But Aunt B wasn't ready to give up. Several days later, she showed up uninvited at my parents' house, demanding to speak with my dad. She claimed we were overreacting and that she had been misunderstood. When my dad refused to entertain her, she exploded, accusing us all of being ungrateful. That's when her own husband, who had quietly endured her antics for countless years, finally had enough. "This has to stop," he said firmly. "You're tearing this family apart, and I won't stand by anymore." He escorted her out of the house, leaving her fuming and humiliated on the front lawn. In the weeks that followed, Aunt B's reputation within the family crumbled. Relatives who once defended her finally saw her true colors. Her schemes, her lies, and her toxic behavior had alienated her from everyone. Kay, too, faded into the background, avoiding family events altogether. Meanwhile, my husband and I focused on building our new life together. We refused to let Aunt B's toxicity overshadow our happiness. The chaos she caused became a story we laughed about, a reminder of how absurd things had gotten and how love and trust had ultimately triumphed. In the end, Aunt B's relentless efforts to tear us apart only brought us closer together. Her manipulation backfired spectacularly, leaving her isolated and humiliated. While it wasn't the ending she wanted, it was exactly the one she deserved.